All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. Let me open us up with a word of prayer here. Gracious God, we thank you for another opportunity to gather together on a Tuesday night to enjoy a meal together, to fellowship with one another, and to study your word. Lord, we pray that you bless the food that we ate to the nourishment of our bodies, that it may provide nourishment and strength for us to serve you better, Lord. We pray over these next minutes that you would just guide our thoughts, guide our discussions. Lord, help us make sense of Isaiah chapter 14 and in coming to understand it better, deepening our knowledge of you and deepening our relationship with you, Lord. We pray also that you be with those who aren't able to make it for whatever reason tonight, that they will be blessed as they watch the video here in a couple of days. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, well, as I said, we are on chapter 14, kind of a long chapter. So let's get started. Let me start off just by reading it for us here. The Lord will have compassion on Jacob. Once again, he will choose Israel and will settle them in their own land. Foreigners will join them and unite with the descendants of Jacob. Nations will take them and bring them to their own place, and Israel will take possession of the nations and make them male and female servants in the Lord's land. They will make captives of their captors and rule over their oppressors. On the day the Lord gives you relief from your suffering and turmoil and from the harsh labor forced on you, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor has come to an end, how his fury has ended. The Lord has broken the rod of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers, which in anger struck down peoples with unceasing blows, and in fury subdued nations with relentless aggression. All the lands are at rest and at peace. They break into singing. Even the junipers and the cedars of Lebanon gloat over you and say, now that you have been laid low, no one comes to cut us down. The realm of the dead below is all astir to meet you at your coming. It rouses the spirits of the departed to greet you, all those who were leaders in the world. It makes them rise from their thrones, all those who were kings over the nations. They will all respond. They will say to you, you also have become weak as we are. You have become like us. All your pomp has been brought down to the grave, along with the noise of your harps. Maggots are spread out beneath you, and worms cover you. How you have fallen from heaven, morning star, son of the dawn. You have been cast down to earth, you who once laid low the nations. You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly, on the utmost heights of Mount Zaphon. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to the realm of the dead, to the depths of the pit. Those who see you stare at you. They ponder your fate. Is this the man who shook the earth and made kingdoms tremble? The man who made the world a wilderness, who overthrew its cities and would not let his captives go home? All the kings of the nations lie in state, each in his own tomb. But you are cast out of your tomb like a rejected branch. You are covered with the slain, with those pierced by the sword. Those who descend to the stones of the pit, like a corpse trampled underfoot. You will not join them in burial, for you have destroyed your land and killed your people. Let the offspring of the wicked never be mentioned again. Prepare a place to slaughter his children for the sins of their ancestors. They are not to rise to inherit the land and cover the earth with their cities. I will rise up against them, declares the Lord Almighty. I will wipe out Babylon's name and survivors, her offspring and descendants, declares the Lord. I will turn her into a place for owls and into swampland. I will sweep her with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord Almighty. The Lord Almighty has sworn, surely as I have planned, so it will be, and as I have purposed, so it will happen. I will crush the Assyrian in my land. On my mountains I will trample him under my feet. His yoke will be taken from my people, and his burden removed from their shoulders. This is the plan determined for the whole world. This is the hand stretched out over all the nations. For the Lord Almighty has purposed, and who can thwart him? His hand is stretched out, and who can turn it back? This prophecy came in the year King Ahaz died. Do not rejoice, all you Philistines, that the rod that struck you is broken. From the root of that snake will spring up a viper. Its fruit will be a darting, venomous serpent. The poorest of the poor will find pasture, and the needy will lie down in safety. But your root I will destroy by famine. It will slay your survivors. Wail, you gate. Howl, you city. Melt away, all you Philistines. A cloud of smoke comes from the north, and there is not a straggler in its ranks. What answer shall be given to the envoys of that nation? The Lord has established Zion, and in her his afflicted people will find refuge. This is the word of the Lord. So as
Can I ask you when we'll have the touchy-feely good part?
well, that's a good question.
Not in Isaiah.
Yeah. We get to some touchy-feely good parts in some of the messianic prophecies.
I never heard of that.
You know.
That might be good.
Yeah, the prophecy of the suffering servant, I believe that's Isaiah 53. Anyway, but there is some good in the prophecies of the coming Messiah.
This is all scary.
So as we look at this, first of all, verses 1 through the first half of verse 4. Let me explain this. When in my outlines, when you see a 4a, that means the first half of the verse. And when you see like a 4b, that means the second half of the verse. So it's dividing the verse up. Some verses go as far as like 4a, 4b, 4c, and 4d. But I don't go that far. Anyway, so in verses 1 through the first half of verse 4, that's the first section of chapter 14. What do you think Isaiah is saying in these verses?
Well, if you'll bear with me, I'll read what I put down.
Okay, go ahead.
I found that this whole chapter 14, I just kept writing, which means I probably don't have the answers. But I wrote, in effect, they provide a reason, they mean the verses provide a reason why Babylon must be overthrown and ruined, because God has mercy in store for his people. It's a fairly clear statement about how God will deal with Israel. He is not through with his chosen people, and also the Gentiles will also be saved.
Yeah, no, I mean that's right on target, right? Because the vision presented in these verses is one of hope, right? In chapter 13, Isaiah detailed the overthrow of Babylon. And here in these verses, we have the result of that overthrow of Babylon, and that's the promised deliverance of God's people. Right? And if we look more closely at the verses 1 and 2 form a sort of epilogue to chapter 13. We see in verse 1 that Isaiah's prophecy is not only meant for the people of Judah, as he says that God will have compassion on Jacob, Judah, and will once again choose Israel. So this is meant to as a promise for all of God's people, Israel and Judah. They'll be united once again as God's chosen people, Israel. And the mention when it says that God will once again choose Israel, it connects the deliverance mentioned in these verses to the deliverance during the Exodus, right? God chose Israel once in Egypt, and he will choose them once again here. This promise then serves as a reminder to God's people that in spite of their sinfulness and rebellion, he still has not abandoned them. In verse 2, we see the result of God once again choosing his people, right? God's people are promised that they will be restored to their own land, but it's not simply going to be a restoration to the status quo, right? Israel, instead of them being joined to foreigners will be added to Israel. Right? And you could see this potentially being a fulfillment in the church when Gentiles join as God's people. Israel won't be dependent upon other nations will be dependent upon Israel. Those who had captured Israel will be captured by Israel. Those who had oppressed Israel will fall under Israel's rule. So in verses 1 and 2, we get a picture of a triumphant and restored Israel living into the promises that God has made to them. In verses 3 and the first half of verse 4, then, it serves as sort of an introduction to the next section of the chapter, but still connecting it to verses 1 and 2. In verse 3, we see a continued connection to the Exodus, as Isaiah states that the Lord will give his people relief from suffering, turmoil, and harsh labor, just as he did in the days of the Exodus. Right? God promises to bring them relief and allow them to finally rest in their own land, the land he has given them. But not only will God bring them relief, we see in verse 4 that he will give them victory to the point that they will stand over the fallen king and taunt him. So we see that these verses continue one of the major themes of Isaiah, and indeed one of the major themes of the Old Testament and one of the major themes of Scripture in general, that God's care and concern for the lowly and oppressed, and his opposition is to those who have exalted themselves. As we continue then with the second half of verse 4, actually all the way through 21. So this is a long section, but it's all one poem. And it's considered to be one of the finest of all the Hebrew poems. Does anybody know what makes this poem so special?
It's the triumphal song of the Jews.
Yeah, it's a triumphal song of the Jews.
When they're delivered from their long and oppressive bondage.
Yep, when they're delivered from...
There are a whole bunch of things. First of all, there's a variety of images, persons, and distinct actions. And then, do they refer to this as the Ode of Isaiah? Have you ever heard that Ode of Isaiah?
I haven't, but it wouldn't surprise me if this is referred to that way. This is pointed to as one of his, probably his finest poems in the entire book, so it wouldn't surprise me if it has a special title of that. I just haven't heard it.
I was reading Problems today before I came.
Good. Yeah, there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of beautiful imagery. One of the Bible commentators I read, John Oswalt, notes that it manifests a balance of terms. It has a forcefulness and a power of imagery that is typical of the best of Hebrew poetry, making the total impact of the poem unforgettable. He says part of the power of that poem lies in its careful mockery of the lament form. So if you know anything about Hebrew poetry, one of the forms of Hebrew poetry is a lament. It's a song that you're lamenting things, be it someone's death, be it negative situations you're going through. And so what this poem does is it actually takes the common elements of a song of lament and turns them around to show that this song for the dead is not a song of grief and lament, it's a song of joy. So it's special in that it's like a reverse lament almost, a song of joy for the death of the king. And the poem itself is divided into 4 stanzas. Verses 4 to 8 depict the relief that is present now that the tyrannical king is gone. Verses 9 to 11 depict the astonishment in the realm of the dead when they realize that this tyrannical king is merely mortal. Verses 12 to 15 moves from the realm of the dead to heaven to depict the fallen king's shame and dishonor are even greater because he pretended to be so great and so exalted. And then verses 16 to 21 move back to the earth to depict the king's denial of a decent burial and the destruction of his descendants.
Who was the king? I missed
That's the next question we're going to talk about. Did anybody have any ideas on who is the king of Babylon to whom we're told the poem is directed towards?
Nebuchadnezzar is literal.
Nebuchadnezzar is one of the literal kings of Babylon, yes.
The
Spiritual king would be Satan. Okay.
I like the name Nebuchadnezzar. It took me 6 years.
Well, yeah, unsurprisingly, there have been many attempts to pinpoint just exactly which king is the subject of this taunt. The problem with trying to exactly pinpoint a single ruler, though, is that no single ruler in Babylonian history led a life that corresponds directly to the life depicted in the poem. We know that none of the kings of what is called the Neo-Babylonian Empire fit the events depicted, those kings being Nebuchadnezzar, another king named Nabonidus. The events of their life don't fit this necessarily. We also know that none of the Assyrian kings of Isaiah's day fit the events depicted. That would be people like Sargon II or Sennacherib. These kings did engender the kind of hatred that is present of the people in this poem, but none of their lives seem to fit the details. Assyrian kings such as Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon, Sennacherib did actually consider themselves to be kings of Babylon. So many scholars say that Isaiah likely patterned the representative king of chapter 14 after these powerful, well-known tyrants. But Isaiah actually gives no indication that he has any of these rulers or any other rulers specifically in mind when he writes this. So taking all of this together then, it's probably best we understand the king of Babylon, to whom the poem is directed, to be a specific representation of the more general statements made in chapter 13. So the king is not an actual historical person. Isaiah seems to be using this king as the concrete representative for the nature of human pride and the end God is going to bring to it. So it seems that this king is more of a metaphor, more of a symbol of human pride and arrogance. As we dive into the poem specifically then, the first section of the poem consists of 2 stanzas, verses 4b to 8 and 9 to 11. So the second half of verse 4 through 11 is kind of the first section of the poem. Anybody get any ideas for what the overarching theme or message of this section is?
Power fades.
Power fades?
God permits you to have power when he leads you and wants you to have power, and then he can take it away when he is done with you needing that power.
Okay. God permits you to have power when he wants and needs it and then can take it away. Yeah, that's good. Any other thoughts?
Rest from sorrow, fear, and bondage, which is the birthright of every believer in Christ.
Rest from sorrow, fear, and bondage, the birthright of every believer. Yeah, that's good too. Yeah, no, those are both great. What we see in the first stanza, I'm going to divide the section further into stanzas. In the first stanza, the second half of verse 4 through verse 8, we see the inhabitants of the earth break out into this jubilant song upon hearing of the king's death. Verses 4b through 6 present a picture of the relentless and constant oppression that the king of Babylon rained down on people. Right? This is evident for us when Isaiah says in verse 6 that the king in anger struck down peoples with unceasing blows and in fury subdued nations with relentless aggression. So we see it was constant. He was oppressing the people. But the king, we read in verses 4 to 5, has met his brutal end at the hands of Almighty God, who has broken the rod of the wicked, the scepter of the rulers. Right? What this shows us is that the God of tiny, almost insignificant Judah is the God of the universe, who can destroy the power of even the world's mightiest monarchs whenever he so wills. As Carla said, power fades. In verse 7, we see that all the lands, people from all over the earth, are at rest in peace in the aftermath of the downfall of the king of Babylon. And in response to this rest and peace, they break out in singing. And singing in view of deliverance is a common but special feature in the book of Isaiah. Because of their deliverance from the oppression of the king of Babylon, his death doesn't lead to the singing and wailing of mourners. It leads to the boisterous and jubilant singing of those who have been delivered. In verse 8, Isaiah reinforced his point of jubilant singing of deliverance with the imagery that all nature will join in on the song. Right? In the ancient Near East, a ruler would prove his power, would prove his dominion with his capacity to destroy. So tyrannical kings would often boast of things like how many lions they had killed or how many trees they had cut down. So when this tyrannical king of Babylon falls, even nature will breathe a sigh of relief and break out in jubilant song. In verses 9 to 11, we're moved from earth to the realm of the dead, as Isaiah shows us that the same event, the death of the king of Babylon, that brought joy and peace on earth, has brought this stirring of activity in the realm of the dead. This activity is based upon the fact that those in the realm of the dead, many of whom were put there by this king, killed by him, now realize that he was no different than they are. Even though his power and his glory may have made him seem immortal and all-powerful, he is no less subject to the corruption and decay of death. He is consigned to the same fate as they are. Verses 9 to 10 picture dead kings seated in thrones in the realm of the dead who rise to their feet when they see the king of Babylon. But they're not rising to their feet to pay him homage. They're rising to their feet to mock him, because in death it was proven that he was no different, he was no greater than they were. Verse 11 uses very vivid imagery in the continuing mockery of the king of Babylon, right? Verse 11 is quite graphic. Maggots are spread out beneath you and worms cover you. Right? What Isaiah is doing here is he's contrasting the pomp and circumstance of the king's royal funeral with the fact that he's become nothing more than a rotting corpse covered with maggots and worms. In this, Isaiah is saying that there is no place, there is no point for human pride, because in the end, the worms bring us all to the same level. We are all consigned to the same worldly fate.
Yeah.
Then as we move into the second section, we're looking at the rest of the poem, verses 12 to 21, again divided into two stanzas, 12 to 15 and 16 to 21. What are some of the themes or messages that stood out to you in these verses?
I'd say the morning star.
The morning star?
Yeah. Just
Okay.
calling him out.
Calling him
Being
out?
Satanic.
Right. Any other thoughts?
Does the scene change from earth to hell?
Well, the scene changed from earth to what we could call hell, even though that word's not used in Isaiah. In verses 9 to 11, that was the realm of the dead. That was hell. Then in verse 12 to 15, it shifts to heaven. And then verse 16, it shifts back to earth. So we kind of go earth, hell, heaven, earth.
How does he say that he will ascend to heaven and will raise my throne above the stars of God? So he's already dead, right? And he's still making that.
Well, this is what he was saying to himself when he was still alive. This is the pride
Oh, okay.
that became, that the king had, that caused God to humble him.
I got it.
Right? So this scene in heaven is not exactly a scene in heaven so much as it is the king saying he was over heaven, proving that he was so proud he needed to be humbled, right? So verses 12 to 15 are meant to show us just how fake and foolish pride really is, right? Now the reference in verse 12, as Mary was talking about, to the morning star, the son of the dawn, is one that's caused some interpretive frustration. Some of the early church fathers linked the reference here to New Testament passages like Luke 10:18 and Revelation 12:8-9, and took this to be a reference to Satan. However, the biblical scholars of the Reformation were unanimous in their argument that the context of verse 12 doesn't support this interpretation of this being Satan. They argue that this passage is discussing human pride, which means the subject must therefore be human and not angelic. Given this context, I tend to agree with the Reformers that this is not a direct reference to Satan, though I think we also can't completely ignore the connection the early church fathers made. Because where does human pride come from? It comes ultimately from the temptation of Satan, right? So if the morning star, son of dawn, doesn't refer specifically to Satan, what does it refer to? I'm going to quote again from Bible commentator John Oswalt here, who explains the reference in detail. He writes that it likely, quote, refers to the planet Venus, which never reaches the zenith before the sun rises and apparently extinguishes it. The Hebrew word Hallel probably comes from the root meaning bright, and thus logically applies to the brightest star. In Canaanite mythology, the god Athtar, with whom the gods attempt to replace Baal at one point, may also be the morning star. In that story, however, Athtar does not seek the position, and upon finding himself unsuited for it, voluntarily leaves it. Recent attempts to derive the Isaiah account from the Greek myth of Phaeton, in which the central figure loses control of the chariot of the sun and is struck by a thunderbolt of Zeus in order to save the earth from the sun's fire, suffer from the evidence that the Greek myth is derived from the Near Eastern stories rather than being the precursor to them. Once again, the indications are that the prophet was not dependent upon any one story, but used a number of current motifs to fit his own point, end quote. Now, I know that was a lot, but with all of that information in tow, what I think we can say is that this reference, Morning Star, Son of the Dawn, is meant to be specifically about the king of Babylon, or who represents all of human pride, exalting itself to the highest level of glory and brightness above God. But so instead of thinking of it specifically as one person, it's a statement on the fact that humans in their pride try to exalt themselves above God. This morning star, who in his pride exalted himself, will be humbled by God, we learn in the rest of verse 12. And this idea of the exaltation of the morning star is laid out in greater detail in verses 13 to 15. Verses 13 and 14 present a sort of inner monologue by the king of Babylon, who is outlining how he plans to exalt himself, right? You said in your heart, I will ascend to the heavens, I will raise my throne above. So this is like the king saying, this is what he's going to do. And this is significant because Bible commentator J. Alec Motyer notes the progressively upward movement in these verses, showing how the king designs to glorify himself. He writes, quote, stars, the highest visible realities, then the Mount of Assembly, which refers to the mythological belief that the gods lived on mountains, such as the Greek gods on Olympus. The king thus envisaged his deification. But more than that, he aspired to the chief place among the gods, represented in the utmost heights. And the sacred mountain, literally the apex of Zaphon, Mount Zaphon in northern Palestine, was the seat of the Canaanite gods. It's mentioned in Psalm 48:2. But the king plans to go higher, above the tops of the clouds, to be like the Most High. The Bible has no animus against godly ambition, but equally it insists that where human arrogance reaches after the stars, it grasps the pit. So we see that the king does, in fact, plan to make himself the morning star. He plans to be the brightest and the best in the sky. In verse 15, we see the result that comes from this foolish pride and arrogance. God humbles the king and resigns him to the realm of the dead, no greater than those he defeated on earth. It's interesting also, we should note that the Hebrew word in verse 15 that's translated as depths is the same word in verse 13 translated as utmost heights. So the exact same word is used in verse 13 and verse 15. And I think that's significant because that's a telling statement that human pride and arrogance, while it grasps for the utmost heights, all it actually reaches is the pit. In verses 16 to 21 then, as I said before, we return from heaven back to earth, where the king is given his final and ultimate disgrace. He is not given a proper burial, and his descendants are destroyed. In verses 16 to 17, we see an image of people passing by the unburied body of the king and marveling at the fact that this disgraced body was the same person who wreaked so much havoc and destruction upon the earth. So this is the king getting his, we could say, just deserts. Right? He had reveled in the desolation and destruction he had carried out, but now he is the one who's received desolation and destruction in his death and disgrace. In verses 18 through the first half of verse 20, we see an image of the king laying unburied without a tomb. Right? All the lesser kings whom he destroyed had tombs, but he didn't. Isaiah acknowledges in verse 18 that the kings of all nations lie in state in their own tombs, thus heightening the humiliation of this king. In verses 19 through the first half of verse 20, Isaiah then contrasts the fate of the king of Babylon with the fate of the other kings who are buried in tombs. In verse 19, Isaiah says that the king of Babylon is cast out of his tomb like a rejected branch. Now, since it seems from the context that the king never had a tomb, how could Isaiah say that he is being cast from his tomb? But it's probably best to understand this statement in the sense of the king being cast out without a tomb, right? He was cast out, he didn't get a tomb. He became discarded like trash. And the reference to a branch seems a bit out of place, right? When it says that he's cast out from his tomb like a rejected branch, But if we understand the original Hebrew phrase is actually more accurately translated abominable branch, and we remember that Isaiah uses branch as a descriptor for offspring, we can understand rejected branch to really be referring to an untimely birth, i.e. a miscarriage. So like a miscarriage is cast out, so too is the king cast out. Isaiah also says in verse 19 that the king of Babylon is clothed with the slain. Everyone he has killed in his lust for power and glory now covers him. Right? To me, this is even a more graphic image than the maggots and the worms, because this gives us a picture of the king's corpse buried underneath a pile of the corpses of those he has killed. Vivid imagery. In the first half of verse 20, we're given the reason for the king's disgrace, because he has enacted unimaginable pain, suffering, and death on both the land and the people under his rule. And then in the second half of verse 20 and 21, the focus is on the destruction of the king's descendants, an act that would essentially remove the king's name from society and from the annals of history. His name would be destroyed. And this is the final point where this poem mocks a traditional lament. In a traditional lament, you long for the deceased person's name to endure, but this poem longed for the deceased person's name to be destroyed. As we move then out of the poem into verses 22 and 23, in these two verses there's a shift to the Lord speaking directly. What is the Lord saying in these verses, 22 and 23?
His verdict on mighty Babylon, that it will no longer exist.
His verdict on mighty Babylon, that it will no longer exist? Yeah, absolutely.
But I think there's also something I wrote down here, and I'm not quite sure why. There's a solemn declaration that has been made that when God makes a purpose, or has a purpose, or expresses a purpose, no one can change it.
When God has a purpose, makes a purpose, no one can change it. Yeah, absolutely. I think you see that here, and then, in verse 24, as we move into the next section, it comes out very clearly. Yeah, when God has a purpose, it's the purpose. The end. Nothing you can do about it.
It's the thought that's going to happen.
Right.
It's kind of like when you die, you're dead. Yeah, kind of.
Yeah, no, that's right on track, I think. So first we should note that verses 22 and 23 do actually serve as evidence that the taunt of the previous poem is meant to be understood figuratively and not as being directed toward one specific individual. Because in these verses we see that it's Babylon as a whole which has become prideful, and Babylon as a whole who will face God's judgment and destruction, not any specific ruler alone. So these verses then serve as God directly stating that he is the one who is enacting this judgment and this punishment upon Babylon. Again, Isaiah wants to make it clear that God is sovereign over history. He's directly involved in history, and he will use the events of history for his own purposes. No matter who it is who physically brings about the fall of Babylon, ultimately it is God's doing, who enacts his plan and purposes through human agents. And as Roger said, there's nothing Babylon can do. There's no way that they can stand up against the divine will of the God of Judah. His will be done.
And that's why you've never met a Babylonian.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a valid point. When you think about, you think about who Isaiah is presenting oracles against. He's presenting oracles against Babylon. He's presenting oracles against Assyria, Philistia. None of those nations exist, but Israel does, Right. Now, there is one little issue here I want to bring up from verse 23. In verse 23, God says that he will turn Babylon into a place for owls. But in other versions, it's translated as a place for porcupines, a place for hedgehogs, a place for bitterns. I never even knew what a bittern was until I was studying for this. Anyway, is this difference something we should be concerned about? Does it prove that the Bible contains inaccuracies?
A place of owls?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I looked it up and it talked about all of those animals being birds of prey. They live in desolate places.
Is it a bird?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's a bird. And it,
waterfowl.
that Babylon should not be inhabited by people, but it's fit only for beasts of prey or these noxious creatures.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, you're right on track there. And the only reason I wanted to bring this up, because it's not that significant of an issue, but it is things like this that Bible critics point to say that the Bible contains inaccuracies and therefore can't be trusted.
It doesn't matter.
Right, exactly. And I think nobody's going to be surprised to hear that I'm going to say, no, this doesn't prove anything about the inaccuracies in the Bible. Right? The issue in translation is the fact that there's debate over the meaning of the Hebrew word kapod. Most lexicons have kapod as meaning porcupine or hedgehog, but others have rejected this idea because they say hedgehogs and porcupines don't occupy swampland. Thus, they translate it as owl or bittern. But I would argue that the literal translation of the word doesn't matter because the point being made, as Judy stated, is that God will leave Babylon so desolate that no human life will live there or thrive there, only animal life.
Makes it scary when you're talking about it. I mean, really all you visualize is like monsters.
Yeah. And the reason I would argue that this issue with translation doesn't prove biblical inaccuracy is because it's a translation issue, not an issue with the original text. The word kapod is in every bit of the Hebrew we have. We just are not 100% sure what it translates to in English. Further, it's a dispute about a very minor detail, right? A very minor word in the text. All biblical texts, and this is a truth, every bit of biblical text that contains important doctrinal, theological information has never been found to contain any disputed words or translations. Everything that every Bible critic points to and says, that's an error, that's an inaccuracy, is a minor, insignificant detail. And it can all, and I learned this in one of my classes. If you were to write out every biblical inaccuracy that any Bible critic has ever pointed out, it would fill up about one page.
My dad,
Out of the thousands of books of the thousands of words of the Bible, that few are disputed. That's pretty significant to me.
My dad used to be English, that's why.
Okay.
Or he died.
As we move then into verses 24 to 27, the subject switches from Babylon to Assyria. What do you think Isaiah is saying in these verses about the Assyrians?
Well, they will no longer be slave owners. In a way, that God would trample or crush them down. Their yoke will be taken from the Lord's people. Their burden removed. He will break Assyria in his land. He will strike them down. It will all happen as he, the Lord, has planned. So Assyria, to me, kind of reminds me of all nations. I think he's talking about all nations. Kind of.
Yeah.
You know, Assyrian and hid in the land. And so it's all nations. He's talking about all nations, and he's talking about God's plan.
Yeah.
Strike them down so that they will no longer be slave owners.
Yeah, and right, and that proof that he's talking about all lands is made for us in verse 26, right? When he says, "This is the plan determined for the whole world," right? So you're right. He's saying this is what I'm saying about Babylon and Assyria, but this is also the plan for the entire world, right? No, you're absolutely right on track, right? Isaiah begins in verse 24 by telling us that the Lord has sworn, and this stresses for us the fact that what he's about to say is assured to happen, because God has declared it and God doesn't go back on his word. The Lord then makes it explicitly clear that everything will happen, everything will be just as he has planned and purposed. It is certain. In verse 25, then the Lord tells us exactly what it is that he has planned and purposed to do, what he's sworn to do. He states that he's going to destroy the Assyrians and take their yoke and burden off of his people. He's had enough of the Assyrians' foolish pride, their tyranny, violence, oppression, so he's decided the time has come for them to be humbled, to be judged and punished according to his divine justice. Verses 26 to 27 form the final, ultimate conclusion of this oracle that actually started back at 13:1. This has all been the same oracle. These verses tell us that Mesopotamia, Babylon, and Assyria are the symbol of the whole earth, as Roger was saying. Every nation which tries to position itself above God in pride and arrogance is included in this oracle. God's hand, as these verses tell us, is stretched out against all of these nations. God has decided in his divine wisdom and justice that these nations should be punished, and there's nothing that anyone can do about it. Now, there is an interesting question to be asked here, because this is the same oracle, right? But the majority of it was about Babylon, but here in these last few verses is focused on Assyria. How do you think we can understand this shift from Babylon to Assyria within the same oracle?
Don't know if I know the answer, but I just said it represents all nations. To me, it was the all-nation concept.
The all-nation concept representing all. Yeah, I definitely think that's part of it, right? And first, we should note that this is the same oracle. The language that Isaiah uses proves that it's meant to be, this oracle against Assyria is meant to be intimately tied in the oracle against Babylon. So why did Isaiah incorporate the Assyrians in this oracle against Babylon? Again, as is the case with a lot of prophetic biblical text, it's caused some problems amongst biblical scholars. But what seems the most logical and likely is that if we understand Isaiah to have been using Babylon as a representative way for all human pride and arrogance, the shift to Assyria here is a shift from the symbolic to the literal, right? No longer is Isaiah using Babylon as a representative. He's now addressing Assyria specifically and her pride and arrogance. Remember, Assyria was the dominant power when Isaiah was alive. So it's like he's using Babylon as this overarching idea and now saying, now Assyria, that you understand that, let me tell you what's going to happen to you type of thing.
Is there any connection to when God destroyed 185,000 Assyrians in one night? Does he bring it up because they would have known that? And it's like, if God says he's going to do it, this is fully going to happen. It did it before.
It could be. I don't know how all the timelines play out of when all those things took place, but it certainly could be. That's definitely a possibility. But I think also, as Roger, you were saying about the idea of all nations, I think taking the fact that even in Isaiah's day, Babylon was the number one threat to Assyria, they were the two dominant powers, that having both of them present together, Isaiah is giving an illustration of the fact that God is the Lord of all nations, the Lord of all kings, the Lord of history. He's just the Lord, right, of everything. And so I think that certainly plays into it as well. Then as we close out the chapter in verses 28 to 32, Isaiah shifts once again. We were in Babylon, then we were in Assyria, now we're in Philistia. What are some of the themes, messages of this oracle against Philistia that you found?
Basically, trust in the Lord and you'll find refuge.
Trust in the Lord and you'll find refuge? Yeah, I think that's significant. Any other thoughts?
Is it built Jerusalem?
What's that, I'm sorry?
Built Jerusalem.
Built Jerusalem, okay. So we're told in verse 28 that God delivered this oracle to Isaiah in the year that King Ahaz died. Now this is one of the few oracles that is given a specific date, and we'll get to whether or not we should take anything out of that in a minute, but I did just want to mention that this is one of the few oracles that we are given a date for. In verses 29 to 30, we're told that there's a contrast between God's people and the Philistines, that God's people have a strong future while the Philistines don't have a future. Now, early commentators often identified the broken rod of verse 29 with Ahaz specifically, or with Israel or the Davidic dynasty more generally. But this interpretation doesn't seem to work because Ahaz had not caused the Philistine any sort of problems to the point they would be rejoicing over his death, and because the reference to Ahaz makes it unlikely that the rod is meant to be generally understood as Israel or the Davidic dynasty. Instead, given the historical and biblical context, others have said that the rod of verse 29 is more likely referring to an Assyrian ruler who died in the same year as King Ahaz. The most likely candidate for this would be Tiglath-Pileser III, who died in 727 BC. We do know that Tiglath-Pileser III did do considerable harm to the Philistines, to the point that they likely would have celebrated his death. Another candidate would be Shalmaneser III, who died in 721 BC. This stems from the fact that there was a widespread revolt upon his death, and it actually took his successor, Sargon II, almost an entire decade to restore full control. But the problem with both of these candidates, Tiglath-Pileser III and Shalmaneser III, is if they were supposed to be the rod, it doesn't make any sense why Isaiah would mention Ahaz's death if it was another monarch whose death was actually important. Further, while there is some evidence that points to Ahaz's death in 727, there's also evidence that he may have died in 715, and there's no evidence that he died in 721. Given all of this information, then, the fact that Ahaz likely died in 715 BC, the fact that we know a Philistine revolt was beginning about that same year, it seems most likely that the broken rod is not meant to be any dead monarch specifically, but meant to rather be the general Assyrian weakness which was prevalent at that time in 715 BC, and which the Philistines were using at the time of Ahaz's death to try to convince Judah to join them in their revolt. So in 715 BC, Ahaz dies. The Assyrians are at a period of weakness, so the Philistines go to Judah and say, hey, the Assyrians are weak, let's go get them. And so this seems to be what is being talked about specifically in these verses. And that's supported by Isaiah's statements regarding a viper springing up from the root of the snake. Right? It seems that Isaiah was warning that even though Assyria was weak at this time, she was far from dead and would reestablish even greater dominance in the future. And we know that to be true because Assyria became even more powerful in the years after Ahaz's death under the rule of Sargon, Sennacherib, and Esarhaddon. In verse 30, we're presented with a much different image than the one of the serpent in verse 29. In this verse, we see Isaiah using the picture of sheep in a pasture to show that he will give protection, provision, and rest to the poor and needy, i.e. his people in Judah, but will bring famine to destroy the strong and powerful, i.e. the Philistines. God is letting the Philistines know that for the proud and mighty there's no hope. They're destined to be extinguished, so that nothing will remain to spring up from them ever again. God is reiterating that the seemingly helpless who depend on him are actually much stronger than the seemingly powerful who refuse such dependency upon him. And then finally, in verses 31 to 32, we first see the promise of doom on the Philistines, and then we see that contrasted with the promise of security for the people of Judah. The command for the gate to wail and the city to howl in verse 31 is likely meant to invoke the imagery of a siege, because that's where the battle often surged, and a siege was around the gates of the city. The reference to a cloud of smoke coming from the north, also in verse 31, seems to be a figurative reference to the Assyrian army who would have attacked Philistia from the north. And then in contrast to the affliction awaiting Philistia in the form of God's judgment at the hands of Assyria, God's people in Zion are protected by his divine security. So we see the contrast here between the fate of Philistia and the fate of God's people.
So basically, what God is saying is, I have destroyed the king of Babylon. I have criticized my people because they have not shown their respect, whatever it will be. And to the Philistines, he's saying, don't think you're safe.
Right.
I want to get you.
Yeah.
And he did.
Right. No, I think you're right on track, right? Because if we take this as understanding this being a time that Assyria is at a weak point in their history, the Philistines are probably going, oh, we can take them now. We got them. And God's saying, not so fast. Right. So this oracle here at the end against the Philistines is the first in a series that we're going to do over the next several weeks against all of Judah's neighbors. Why do you think Isaiah is taking this time to prophesy against Judah's neighboring countries?
Well, I wrote down that he's emphasizing his power and the destruction of the whole world for those who do not trust in his mercy through Jesus.
Okay, emphasizing his power and destruction of the whole world for those who don't trust in Jesus. Yeah, I think that's part of it. Any other thoughts?
I didn't answer that.
Thank you for your honesty. Carla said, I didn't answer that one.
You have the sword.
One or two I didn't answer, that's all.
So you're on the right track there, but specifically, the nations surrounding Judah, in most cases, were bigger and stronger than Judah, and so therefore they might have been a source of temptation for God's people. That is, the people of Judah might have looked to these nations for deliverance from the Mesopotamian powers of Assyria and Babylon, rather than looking to God alone for that deliverance. So Isaiah wants to make it known amongst Judah that their neighbors are under the same sentence that Assyria and Babylon are under. So there's no reason to put their faith in them, because there's nothing they can do to help Judah either. So the oracles against Judah's neighbors are meant once again to point God's people to him as their only source of hope and security. Now, let's get to this issue of the fact that this oracle against the Philistines is specifically dated in the year that King Ahaz died. Do you think it's significant that this oracle is dated, and why do you think it's significant?
Well, I think the details let you know that they're actual events.
The details let you know they're actual events? Yeah.
Support, yeah.
Yeah, I think first and foremost, dating the oracle is significant, because if it wasn't, Isaiah wouldn't have done it, right? Any thoughts as to why it's significant, other than to prove the validity? I think that's a valid reason. Any other thoughts?
Well, I don't know, the only other thing that I wrote down was that his son took over for the king,
Mm-hmm.
and he was a good guy.
Okay.
He was a good guy, and he did what was right in the eyes of the Lord.
Did what was right in the eyes of
So,
them.
I guess what I'm saying is, it's kind of like, you had all this bad stuff going on, and all these leaders and everything else, but now comes a guy that is just the opposite.
Okay, so the death of King Ahaz is significant because of who succeeded him. Okay, that could be. Yeah, I think there's several reasons. I'm going to quote again from a Bible commentator, because he just says it, and it was easier for me just to quote him than try to distill it all out. And it's going to be a lot of history, but I think it proves the point. Ahaz was a significant king to Isaiah, for as we have seen, the prophet understood Ahaz's refusal to walk by faith and his commitment to political salvation by an alliance with Assyria as being the death knell of the dynasty of David. Would that happen with his death? Throughout the Assyrian period, Philistia was a ceaseless agitator for rebellion. In 734 BC, Gath refused tribute and was sacked. In 720, Philistia connived with Egypt to rebel, and Sargon II defeated Egypt at Gath and took Ashkelon and Gaza. In 711, Ashdod was somehow central to an unsuccessful West Palestinian revolt. In 705, Ashkelon rebelled and fell to Sennacherib in his campaign of 701. The death of Ahaz in 715 would well have been the occasion of a Philistine approach to Hezekiah with a view to joint anti-Assyrian action. At any rate, such an embassy, maybe under cover of a mission of condolence on the death of his father, is a scenario which fits this oracle like a glove. We can start by asking what question would prompt the answer proposed in verse 32 with its emphasis, "It is the Lord who has founded Zion, and it is in it that his downtrodden people will find refuge." was another foundation, an alliance with Philistia and Egypt being proposed, another refuge for a small beleaguered people. To Isaiah, all this was pernicious. The times might well be menacing, and the prospect of recovering independent sovereignty enticing, but all the security Zion and its people needed was in the Lord. So basically what all of that is saying is the king, dating this oracle in the year King Ahaz died, was meant for the original audience to draw to mind what was going on in the world at the time Ahaz died. All of this rebellion and revolt and infighting and just this political intrigue. Ugly, very ugly, right? And it was to call that to their mind to show them that in the middle of all of this ugliness, all of this craziness, trust in the Lord. He's all you need, even in spite of all of this. And so that seems to be the main reason for dating the oracle in the year of Ahaz's death. So quickly here, the last two questions. We'll end where we always end. What does chapter 14 teach us specifically about God?
He's king.
He's king. Yep. Any other thoughts?
He's all powerful, his thought will be done, whatever God has decided that will happen, God provides hope.
He's all powerful. Whatever he's decided will be done, he provides hope. Yep, all good thoughts.
And I have, your place of security is not in your wealth or your status or being self-sufficient. It's being poor in spirit and turning to God for your security and your hope.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely one of the good lessons in this chapter. Yeah, those are all good. A couple that I got along those same lines. First, I think it's a reminder that God is a God who keeps his promises. He promised the destruction of Babylon and Assyria and Philistia, and those promises were fulfilled. Second, I think it reminds us that God is a God of judgment. Right? I think too often as believers we focus on God's qualities that we like, his love, his compassion, his mercy, his grace. And this chapter reminds us, though, that there's also justice and judgment and wrath.
See the fluffy pretty stuff.
Yeah. But I do think this chapter also reminds us of some good things about God. It reminds us that God provides for those who know him. This chapter is filled with references to the fact that God is going to restore his people to the land. He's going to give them provision and rest. He's going to keep them safe. Right? He provides for his people. And fourth, this chapter reminds us, Roger, kind of as you said, that God has a plan, he has a purpose, and he will absolutely make sure that they come to fruition in the world. And then finally, apart from what we learned about God, is there anything else you can think of how the message of chapter 14 is relevant for us today?
Well, we talked about this before, but I wrote down we should not live in fear because God is with us.
Should not live in fear because God is with us? Absolutely.
China and Russia, the modern day Assyria and Babylon.
Or is America?
What do you say usually about this time? You say the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yep.
And that, you said that
Or
about 3 or 4
or as the
times.
teacher in Ecclesiastes would say, there's nothing new under the sun.
100% true.
Yeah, no, those are all good. A few that I got. I think this chapter is a great reminder of the danger of human pride and arrogance. Right? God despises pride because it is pride, that is the desire to be the God of our own lives, that leads us into sin. Therefore, God's punishment of the proud in this chapter reminds us we need to humble ourselves and submit to him before he humbles us. Because if he has to humble us, it's not going to be a good time for anybody. Second, in line with that previous point about pride, this chapter reminds us of the importance of submitting ourselves to God and depending on him. We need to discern his will and his plan for our life and then get in line and follow where he leads. Third, I think this chapter reminds us, as I talked about in my sermon on Ecclesiastes 3:16-22 last Sunday, reminds us that evil and injustice will not go unpunished. That we can have the confidence of knowing that God is going to make all things right, as evidenced by his punishment of Babylon, Assyria, and Philistia. And I just realized in my notes, I'm going to say his punishment of Babylon, Israel, and Philistia. That should say Assyria, not Israel there. And then finally, I think this passage reminds us that we are hopeless and helpless on our own. We need Christ to protect us, to provide for us, to support us, because he is the only true source of stability and certainty in the universe, kind of like what you were saying there, Judy. So with that, that is all I have this evening. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
That was a good section. It was a lot of things.
Yeah, it's a big chapter. I know, after doing my last Bible study on Revelation and this one on Isaiah, I think I want to go for something a little more straightforward, like one of the Gospels or something along those lines. All right. Judy, could I get you to close us in prayer?
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this time together. We thank you for opening our hearts to understand your words and to guide us, and help us as we go out into the week, that the promises that you've made, we know you will keep, and just help us to be good stewards of your word, and help us to share what we're learning with those around us. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. I'll have the outlines for chapter 14 back there, as well as questions for next week.